Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., the phone rings in the safest neighborhood in the city. The caller never speaks, just breathes into the receiver for exactly 60 seconds, then hangs up. After 2 weeks, the call suddenly stopped. What I discovered about the caller would force me to question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin line between them. I'm Detective James Carter, and in 23 years of police work, I thought I'd seen everything. Missing persons, murders, fraud cases that kept me awake at night trying to piece together the puzzle. But the case of the midnight caller would challenge every logical explanation I'd ever relied on. The call came into the station on a Thursday morning in October. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, 74 years old, lived alone on Sycamore Street in Riverside Heights, one of those picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods where the biggest crime is usually someone forgetting to bring in their garbage cans. "Detective Carter," she said in a voice that shook with exhaustion and fear, "someone has been calling my house every single night for 2 weeks. They never say anything, just breathe into the phone. I'm scared to sleep." Harassment calls weren't unusual, but something about Mrs. Henderson's tone made me take notice. She wasn't just annoyed or frustrated, she was genuinely terrified. "Mrs. Henderson, have you tried not answering the phone?" "I tried that for 3 nights. But detective, the phone rings exactly 60 times if I don't pick up. 60 times at 3:33 in the morning. It wakes up my neighbors." "What happens when you do answer?" "Just breathing. Deep, slow breathing for exactly 1 minute. Then they hang up." "Have you tried calling the number back?" "The number shows up as blocked on my caller ID, but I had my neighbor's grandson help me with some kind of reverse lookup thing on the computer. The calls are coming from 5550147. I wrote down the number and ran it through our database. What I found made the case immediately more interesting. The phone number 5550147 had been disconnected 5 years ago. It had belonged to Robert Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's deceased husband. I drove out to Sycamore Street that afternoon to interview Mrs. Henderson in person. Riverside Heights was exactly what I expected: perfectly maintained lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of neighborhood watch signs that actually meant something. Mrs. Henderson's house was a small ranch-style home with a garden that showed the careful attention of someone who had plenty of time and took pride in details. She met me at the door wearing a floral dress and an expression of relief that someone was finally taking her seriously. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you about your husband Robert." Her face immediately changed. "What does Robert have to do with these phone calls?" "The number that's been calling you belonged to your husband." She stared at me for a long moment, then invited me inside. The living room was decorated with 40 years of marriage memories, wedding photos, vacation pictures, grandchildren's artwork on the refrigerator. But I noticed that while there were photos of Robert throughout the house, they all appeared to be at least 5 years old. "Mrs. Henderson, when did your husband pass away?" 5 years ago this month. October 15th. He had a heart attack in his sleep. "And his phone number was disconnected after that?" "Yes, I called the phone company within a week of the funeral. There was no reason to keep paying for a line no one would use." I made notes, but something felt incomplete about her story. In my experience, people who've been married for decades usually keep their spouse's phone active for months, sometimes years, just to hear their voice on the voicemail message. "Mrs. Henderson, forgive me for asking, but was your husband's death sudden?" "No warning signs." She hesitated. "Detective, why are you asking about Robert? He's been gone for 5 years. These phone calls just started 2 weeks ago. I'm trying to understand all the connections. Sometimes seemingly unrelated details matter in cases like this. Robert's death was unexpected. He'd been acting strangely in the weeks before he died." "Strangely how?" "He'd become obsessed with that phone. He would sit in his chair in the evening and just stare at it as if he was waiting for someone to call. When I asked him about it, he said he was expecting important news." "What kind of news?" "He never told me." "But detective, Robert had been retired for 10 years. What kind of important news could he have been expecting?" I spent another hour interviewing Mrs. Henderson about the recent calls. She showed me the call log on her phone, and sure enough, there were 14 calls over the past 2 weeks, all at exactly 3:33 a.m., all from number 5550147. But when I contacted the phone company to trace the calls, I hit the first major obstacle in the case. "Detective Carter," said Jake Martinez, the telecommunications technician who met me at the phone company's local office, "I've been working for Mountain Bell for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Jake was a guy in his early 30s who clearly knew his way around phone systems. He had pulled up the call records on his computer and was staring at the screen with genuine confusion. What exactly are you seeing, Jake? These calls are definitely showing up in our system as originating from 5550147. But detective, that number has been completely disconnected for 5 years. The physical line was removed, the number was returned to our available pool, and it's never been reassigned. Could someone have hacked into your system? That's what I thought initially. But I've run every diagnostic test we have. The calls aren't coming through our network illegally. According to our system, they're legitimate calls from a legitimate number. Except that number doesn't exist anymore. Jake pulled up another screen. Look at this. Our system shows that 5550147 has been active for the past 2 weeks, making outgoing calls every night at 3:33 a.m. But when I run a line test on that number, I get a result that says the line was permanently disconnected on October 22nd, 5 years ago. Is it possible that the number was accidentally reactivated? Detective, I personally oversaw the disconnection of that line. Robert Henderson had died, his wife requested disconnection, and we physically removed the equipment. There's no way that number could be making calls. I left the phone company more confused than when I'd arrived. According to their records, a disconnected phone number was somehow making calls to the house where it used to be connected. Either there was a technical explanation I wasn't understanding, or something much stranger was happening. That evening, I decided to stake out Mrs. Henderson's house. If a call came in at 3:33 a.m. like clockwork, I wanted to be there to witness it firsthand. I parked across the street at 11 p.m. and settled in for a long night. Riverside Heights was the kind of neighborhood that went to sleep early. By midnight, every house on the street was dark except for the occasional porch light. At 3:32 a.m. I was fully alert, watching Mrs. Henderson's house through my car window. At exactly 3:33, I saw a light come on in what I assumed was her bedroom. The phone was ringing. I got out of my car and approached the house quietly. Through the thin walls, I could hear the phone ringing, a sharp, old-fashioned ring that suggested Mrs. Henderson still used a landline with an actual bell. After about 15 rings, the ringing stopped. Mrs. Henderson had answered. I positioned myself near her bedroom window, not to invade her privacy, but to see if I could hear anything from the caller's end. What I heard made my blood run cold. There was no breathing. There was no sound at all from the caller's end. But Mrs. Henderson was talking to someone. I know it's you, she whispered into the phone. What do you want from me? Silence. I'm sorry, Robert. I'm so sorry. But you can't keep calling me like this. My heart started racing. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just receiving harassment calls. She believed she was talking to her dead husband. Please, Robert. Just let me sleep. I promise I'll tell them the truth, but please stop calling me. The conversation continued for exactly 60 seconds, with Mrs. Henderson speaking in long periods of silence that I assumed were the caller breathing. When she hung up, the light in her bedroom stayed on for another 20 minutes before going dark. I sat in my car until sunrise, trying to process what I'd heard. Either Mrs. Henderson was having a psychological breakdown brought on by grief and the stress of the harassment calls, or something genuinely unexplainable was happening. The next morning, I returned to Mrs. Henderson's house with more questions. Mrs. Henderson, last night when you answered the phone, I heard you mention telling someone the truth. What did you mean by that? She looked startled. Detective, were you listening to my private phone conversation? I was conducting surveillance to help solve your case. Mrs. Henderson, do you believe these calls are coming from your deceased husband? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Detective Carter, what would you say if I told you that I recognize the breathing? That after 43 years of marriage, I know the sound of my husband's breathing when he's upset. I'd say that grief can make us hear things that aren't there. And what would you say if I told you that the caller knows things only Robert would know? What kind of things? The first night he called, I asked who it was. He didn't speak, but he tapped on the phone receiver. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. I felt a chill run down my spine. SOS in Morse code. Robert was in the Navy for 4 years before we met. He taught me Morse code when we were dating because he thought it was romantic that we could have secret messages. Mrs. Henderson, what did you mean when you said you would tell them the truth? She started crying. Not the gentle tears of an elderly woman remembering her husband, but the deep, racking sobs of someone carrying enormous guilt. Detective, there's something I never told anyone about the night Robert died. I got out my notebook, sensing that we were approaching the real heart of this case. Robert didn't die of a heart attack in his sleep. What do you mean? He died of a heart attack, but he wasn't sleeping. He was on the phone. Who was he talking to? I don't know. It was 3:33 in the morning and the phone rang. Robert answered it immediately as if he'd been waiting for the call. He talked for about a minute, then he made this horrible gasping sound and collapsed. Did you hear what he said during the phone call? He kept saying, "I understand," and "I'm ready." Then, right before he collapsed, he said, "Tell Eleanor I'm sorry." Sorry for what? I never found out. The paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Robert was gone. Mrs. Henderson, why didn't you tell anyone about this? Because I was ashamed. My husband had a heart attack and died, and instead of calling 911 immediately, I spent 5 minutes trying to figure out who had called him. By the time I called for help, it was too late to save him. I was beginning to understand the psychology of what was happening, but I still couldn't explain the technical impossibility of the phone calls. Mrs. Henderson, do you still have Robert's personal effects? Papers, address books, anything that might give us a clue about who called him that night? She led me to a small office where Robert's desk had been preserved exactly as he'd left it. Bills paid and filed, appointment calendar, and a small address book with phone numbers written in careful handwriting. As I flipped through the address book, one entry caught my attention. Rebecca Santos with a phone number and an address in Riverside Heights. But next to her name, Robert had written RIP October 13th, in pencil. Mrs. Henderson, who is Rebecca Santos? She was a neighbor who lived a few streets over. She died in a car accident about 5 years ago, just 2 days before Robert. Were Robert and Rebecca close? Mrs. Henderson's expression became uncomfortable. Detective, I think Robert and Rebecca were having an affair. The case was becoming more complex. Robert Henderson had died while receiving a mysterious phone call 2 days after his alleged lover had died in a car accident. Now, 5 years later, someone was calling his widow from his old phone number. Mrs. Henderson, what makes you think Robert was having an affair? Small things. He started dressing better, wearing cologne, leaving the house at odd times without explaining where he was going. And he was secretive about his phone calls. Did you ever confront him about it? The week before he died, I asked him directly if he was seeing someone else. He denied it, but he looked guilty. He said he was helping a friend with a personal problem, but he couldn't tell me the details. Did you know Rebecca Santos personally? We'd met at neighborhood events, but we weren't friends. She was much younger than me, probably in her 50s. Her husband had died a few years earlier and she lived alone. I made note of Rebecca's address and decided to investigate her background. If Robert Henderson had been involved with Rebecca Santos, and both had died within 2 days of each other, there might be a connection to the current phone calls. Rebecca Santos had lived at 847 Pine Street, about 6 blocks from the Hendersons. The house was currently occupied by new owners, but I was able to track down Rebecca's surviving family members through county records. Rebecca's daughter, Maria Santos Clark, lived across town and agreed to meet with me. Detective Carter, I'm surprised anyone is asking about my mother after all these years. Is this related to some kind of cold case? Maria was a woman in her 30s who clearly resembled her mother based on photos I'd seen in newspaper archives about the car accident. I'm investigating a harassment case that may have connections to your mother's death. Can you tell me about her relationship with Robert Henderson? Maria's expression became guarded. What kind of relationship? We have reason to believe they may have been close friends. Detective, my mother was a private person, but she wasn't secretive. If she'd been dating someone, she would have told me. What can you tell me about the circumstances of her death? She was driving home from the grocery store on October 13th, about 9 p.m. She hit a tree on Riverside Drive. The police said she probably fell asleep at the wheel or had some kind of medical episode. Was that unusual behavior for your mother? That's what was strange about it. My mother was an extremely careful driver, especially at night. She usually avoided driving after sunset because her night vision wasn't good. But she was out at 9 p.m.? She called me around 8:30 that night and said she had to go buy something important. She wouldn't tell me what it was, just that it couldn't wait until morning. Did your mother seem upset or worried about anything in the days before her death? Maria thought for a moment. Actually, yes. She'd been receiving strange phone calls for about a week before she died. I felt the familiar tingle of a case breaking open. What kind of phone calls? Someone would call and not say anything, just breathe into the phone. It was happening every night around the same time. What time? 3:33 a.m. The pattern was becoming clear, but it raised more questions than it answered. Rebecca Santos had been receiving the same mysterious calls that Mrs. Henderson was getting now. Rebecca had died, then Robert had died, and now someone was calling Mrs. Henderson from Robert's old phone number. Maria, did your mother ever mention Robert Henderson specifically? Not by name, but she did say she was helping an older man with a personal problem. She said he was married and felt guilty about asking for her help. What kind of help? She never gave me details. But detective, my mother was a nurse before she retired. She often helped neighbors with medical questions or emotional support. Do you think the relationship was romantic? I honestly don't know. My mother was still grieving my father's death, but she was also lonely. It's possible she developed feelings for someone, but she would have been very discreet about it. I left my meeting with Maria Santos Clark with a clearer picture of the events from 5 years ago, but I still couldn't explain the current phone calls. Someone was using a disconnected phone number to call Mrs. Henderson, and that someone apparently knew intimate details about Robert Henderson's final days. That afternoon, I returned to the phone company to meet with Jake Martinez again. Jake, I need you to help me with something that might sound crazy. Is there any way that a phone call could originate from a specific number without using the actual phone line? You mean like spoofing the caller ID? Maybe. But these calls are showing up in your system as legitimate calls from a disconnected number. Jake pulled up his diagnostic screens again. Detective, I've been thinking about this case since we talked yesterday. I ran some additional tests and I found something weird. What kind of weird? The calls to Mrs. Henderson are definitely coming through our system, but they're not originating from any physical phone line. It's as if the calls are being generated inside our computer system itself. Is that possible? Technically, yes. If someone had access to our central switching system, they could potentially create fake call records and route calls through the system without using a physical phone. Who would have that kind of access? Current employees, former employees with retained access codes, or someone with serious hacking skills? Jake, I need you to pull the personnel records for everyone who had access to the Henderson account 5 years ago. An hour later, Jake had compiled a list of 12 phone company employees who had worked on the Henderson account during the disconnection process. One name on the list immediately caught my attention. Rebecca Santos. Jake, this Rebecca Santos who worked for the phone company, what was her job? She was a customer service supervisor. She would have had access to all account information and the ability to modify service records. When did she stop working for the company? Jake checked his records. She died in October 5 years ago. Car accident. The case was starting to make sense. Rebecca Santos had been a phone company employee who met Robert Henderson through her work. They had developed some kind of relationship, possibly romantic. Rebecca had access to the phone systems and could have been making the mysterious calls to herself as part of some elaborate plan. But Rebecca was dead and Robert was dead, so who was making the calls now? Jake, I need you to check something for me. In the 2 weeks before Rebecca Santos died, were there any unusual activities on her employee account? Jake spent 20 minutes searching through archived records. Detective, this is interesting. In the week before Rebecca died, she accessed the system remotely dozens of times, always between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. What was she doing during those late-night sessions? It looks like she was setting up some kind of automated calling system. She programmed the computers to generate calls from specific numbers at specific times. Including calls from Robert Henderson's number? No, that's the strange part. She programmed calls to Robert Henderson's number, not from it. I stared at Jake, trying to understand the implications. So Rebecca was calling Robert's house at 3:33 a.m.? According to these records, yes. She set up an automated system to call his number every night at 3:33 a.m. for 2 weeks. But Mrs. Henderson said Robert died while receiving a phone call at 3:33 a.m. Right. And according to our records, that call came from Rebecca's automated system. The pieces were falling into place. Rebecca Santos, working for the phone company, had programmed an automated calling system to contact Robert Henderson every night. On October 15, 5 years ago, Robert had answered one of those calls and died of a heart attack during the conversation. But Rebecca had died 2 days earlier, on October 13th. So who had been making the calls on October 14th and 15th? Jake, if Rebecca set up an automated system, would it continue running after her death? Only if someone else knew how to access it and keep it active. Who else would have had access to her employee account? Her supervisor, maybe a few co-workers. But detective, here's the really strange part. According to our security logs, Rebecca's employee account is still active. What do you mean, still active? Someone has been accessing her account remotely for the past 5 years. Not frequently, just once a month to keep the account from being automatically deactivated. And 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, someone used Rebecca's account to reactivate the automated calling system. Same target number, now calling Mrs. Henderson instead of Robert, same time, same frequency. I felt like I was finally approaching the truth, but I needed to understand who had access to Rebecca's employee account and why they would wait 5 years to reactivate the calling system. Jake, can you trace the remote access to Rebecca's account? Find out where those logins are coming from. I can try, but it might take a few hours. While Jake worked on tracing the remote access, I decided to revisit Mrs. Henderson with new questions. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you about Rebecca Santos again. Did you know she worked for the phone company? No, I had no idea. I just knew her as a neighbor. Did Robert ever mention having problems with your phone service around the time of his death? Actually, yes. For about 2 weeks before he died, we were getting strange calls in the middle of the night. Robert always answered them, but he said there was never anyone there. Did Robert seem to know who was calling? He acted like he did. He would say things like, "I understand," and "I know what you want me to do." But when I asked him about it, he said it was just telemarketers. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you a difficult question. Do you think it's possible that Rebecca Santos was calling your house to threaten Robert about their relationship? She was quiet for a long time. Detective, there's something else I never told anyone. What is it? The day before Rebecca died, she came to my house. She wanted to talk to me about Robert. What did she say? She told me that Robert had been helping her with a serious problem, but that she was worried he was getting too involved. She said she cared about him but didn't want to destroy our marriage. Did she say what kind of problem? She said someone had been threatening her, making anonymous phone calls, demanding money. She said Robert had offered to help her figure out who was doing it. Did she mention anything about her work at the phone company? She said she thought someone at her job might be involved because the calls seemed to know personal information about her that only co-workers would know. The case was becoming clearer. Rebecca Santos had been receiving threatening calls from someone, possibly a co-worker at the phone company. Robert Henderson had been helping her investigate the threats. Rebecca had used her access to the phone system to set up some kind of plan to catch the person threatening her. But something had gone wrong. Rebecca had died in a car accident, and Robert had died while receiving one of the automated calls Rebecca had programmed. Mrs. Henderson, did Rebecca mention any specific co-workers she suspected? She mentioned someone named Jake, but she said he was trying to help her. She was more worried about a supervisor who had been acting strangely around her. Jake Martinez. The same technician who had been helping me with the investigation. I immediately called Jake's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove to the phone company office, but the security guard said Jake had left early, claiming he felt sick. That evening, I parked outside Jake's apartment complex and waited. At 3:30 a.m., I saw Jake leave his apartment building and drive toward Riverside Heights. I followed him at a distance, already knowing where he was going. Jake parked 3 blocks from Mrs. Henderson's house and walked through the neighborhood carrying a small electronic device. I watched from my car as he positioned himself near a phone company utility box about a block from Mrs. Henderson's house. At exactly 3:33 a.m., Jake activated the device he was carrying. A few seconds later, I could see lights come on in Mrs. Henderson's house as her phone began ringing. I approached Jake quietly from behind and placed him under arrest. Jake Martinez, you're under arrest for harassment and fraud. Jake didn't resist, but he did start talking immediately. Detective, you don't understand. I never meant for any of this to happen. Back at the station, Jake's story came out slowly over several hours of questioning. 5 years ago, Jake had developed an obsession with his co-worker Rebecca Santos. When she rejected his romantic advances, he began making threatening phone calls to her house, hoping to frighten her into needing his protection. I thought if Rebecca was scared, she would turn to me for help, Jake explained. I knew about phone systems so I could make the calls untraceable. But Rebecca had been smarter than Jake anticipated. She figured out that someone at the phone company was making the threatening calls, and she suspected Jake. Rebecca set up that automated calling system as a trap, Jake continued. She programmed it to call Robert Henderson's house at the same time I usually called her. She wanted to see if I would stop calling her when I was busy dealing with another technical problem. But Rebecca died before the trap could work. She died because of me. The night of October 13th, I figured out what she was doing. I called her and told her I knew about the automated system. I said if she didn't delete it and drop her suspicions about me, I would report her for misusing company equipment. What happened then? Rebecca panicked. She said she had to go fix the system that night before anyone else discovered it. She left her house at 9 p.m. to drive to the phone company office. And she had the car accident on the way. She was upset and scared because of our conversation. I never meant for her to get hurt. But you kept using her employee account to access the phone system. I was afraid that if her account was deactivated, someone might investigate and discover what she'd been doing. I thought if I kept it minimally active, no one would look too closely. Why did you reactivate the calling system 2 weeks ago? Jake was quiet for a long time. Because Mrs. Henderson came to the phone company asking about calls from her husband's old number. I realized she might start investigating, and I was afraid she would discover what had really happened 5 years ago. So you thought harassing her with fake calls from her dead husband would make her stop investigating? I thought it would make her think she was having psychological problems because of grief. I thought she would get counseling and stop worrying about the technical aspects of the phone calls. Jake Martinez was charged with criminal harassment, fraud, and misuse of telecommunications equipment. The charges related to Rebecca Santos's death were harder to pursue, since he hadn't directly caused the car accident, but the district attorney's office was exploring options. Mrs. Henderson took the news about Jake's arrest with a mixture of relief and sadness. Detective Carter, I'm glad to know the calls will stop, but I'm heartbroken to learn that Robert died because he was trying to help someone. Mrs. Henderson, your husband was a good man who got caught up in a situation that wasn't his fault. Do you think Robert knew what was happening to Rebecca? I think he suspected someone was threatening her and he was trying to help her prove it. The automated calls Rebecca set up were part of a plan to catch Jake, but Robert didn't know that when he answered the phone that final night. What do you think Rebecca said to Robert during that last phone call? Based on Jake's confession and the phone records, I don't think Rebecca said anything to Robert that night. The automated system was just designed to connect the call, not to play a recorded message. Robert probably answered the phone, heard silence, and the stress of everything that had been happening triggered his heart attack. 3 months later, I received a letter from Mrs. Henderson. She had moved to a smaller apartment across town and was doing well. She'd started volunteering at a grief counseling center, helping other people who had lost their spouses. Detective Carter, she wrote, I wanted to thank you for finding the truth about those phone calls. For a while, I thought I was losing my mind, or that Robert was somehow trying to contact me from beyond. Learning that it was all because of one person's obsession and lies was actually a relief. At least now I can grieve properly and remember Robert for the good man he was. The case of the Midnight Caller taught me something important about the work I do. Sometimes the most frightening mysteries have very human explanations. Jake Martinez's obsession with Rebecca Santos had created a chain of events that led to 2 deaths and months of psychological torture for an innocent widow. But it also reminded me that technology can be used to create illusions that seem supernatural. In an age where phone calls can be spoofed, records can be faked, and computer systems can be manipulated, it's more important than ever to look for the human motivations behind seemingly impossible events. Every case tells a story, and the story of the Midnight Caller was ultimately about how love can be twisted into obsession, and how one person's inability to accept rejection can destroy multiple lives. The phone calls to Mrs. Henderson stopped the night Jake Martinez was arrested. Her house on Sycamore Street is quiet now, and she sleeps peacefully through the night. But sometimes, when I'm working late cases that involve technology and impossible circumstances, I remember that behind every mysterious phone call, every unexplained signal, every piece of evidence that doesn't make sense, there's usually a very human story waiting to be discovered. The dead don't make phone calls. But the living sometimes pretend they do, and it's my job to tell the difference.